Welcome back. We have Mr. Dr. Higa here.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just thought I'd say this because I even have a t-shirt that says not that kind of doctor. Technically speaking, you only really call medical doctors doctor unless you're in a specific like educational or academic condition situation, in which case then doctor might be appropriate. This is a fun stream, so I'm not. Anyway, Higa power was kind of a weird thing to see. I have to admit, I was a little taken aback. But anyway, hi everybody. Welcome to our extra live stream. Remember that we're here as a charity event for the Children's Miracle Network Hospital Group, and we really appreciate those donations. It's really cool. We hit 6,000. That's awesome. Um, this presentation, I have two presentations this stream. This presentation is a serious one. And I have another one in about 20 hours. That's a goofy one. That's going to be basically all my favorite military themed anime. So as you can see, the duality of man, I suppose. But this is the serious one, and I'm going to talk a little bit about modern armor and sort of like the idea of sort of like how sort of military technology has evolved in the post-war period and all the ramifications and everything else. So I guess we'll start the presentation if that's okay.
Before we start,
Oh, yep.
we've hit a milestone. We
Oh,
are now at $6,000,
Oh, so we
even
did hit the 6,000.
flat.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think I saw someone in the chat. Thank you very much for that donation. We
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
thank you very much. And as a thank you to you guys, we have a code to share for you, and this
Awesome.
includes 500 free XP and 50 gold. So you go ahead and drop this into our website, and you shall be able to receive the goodies.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, without further
Nice.
ado, I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, and again, I have a tendency to ramble, so I appreciate you guys bearing with me. I'm not actually playing tanks because, well, first of all, I'm a so-so player, but what I've also noticed is that when I'm trying to stream and play at the same time, I can either do one or the other. I can never do both. So that's kind of why you see me eating and talking about stuff because I cannot play and stream. People who can play and stream, I give them a ton of credit because that's really hard to do. Anyway, so today's the first presentation I'm going to do is kind of just like I thought I'd put together some notes on sort of the post-war evolution of strategy, tactics, and armor. We've kind of been talking about it a little bit, but now that we've added the Cold War stuff, that I feel like we can talk about it more in earnest now, and we can move a little bit uh, forward in time. And so that's kind of why I put this thing together. So first of all, basically, whenever we talk about tanks and hardware and everything else, there's a tendency to focus on the hardware, but that hardware is usually made with a purpose, and that purpose is to serve the strategy of the time. And so what I thought I'd do is I sort of set the stage for the context of sort of the post-war tanks and post-war tank development. Again, I am not a tank subject matter expert. We have a lot of those at Wargaming. Um, I do have some experience. Like I said, I think if you've heard some of my previous presentations, as a game developer, I've actually done stuff for the U.S. Army, a couple projects, and I've been straddling, and then my actual specialty in academia was international relations with an emphasis on strategic studies and on international political economy. So it kind of I kind of touched on all these areas in academia before I entered game development. And then once I entered game development, I kind of did that further. I did both an artillery simulator for Call for Fires trainer for the U.S. Army and some social political like nation building stuff and role playing games and stuff like that. So I have a little bit of a military background, but we have a lot of specific tank experts. So I'm just talking about broad strokes and general theory. Okay. So first of all, if we think about World War II and the end of World War II, World War II was really an ally of unlikely friends, and in fact, you wouldn't really call them friends. They were much more enemy of my enemy. You had the old world colonial powers of Europe. You had sort of the new emerging economies like the United States, and then you had sort of the leading socialist bloc like the Soviet Union. And so the three of them working together made sense in the sense that they were the logical allies to fight against the Axis. But in terms of their ideological and sort of political motivations, you could see that they were, in conflict, and that kind of the tension between these enemy of my enemy would become apparent once the war ended. Um, at the end of World War II, what we basically saw were that there were basically two dominant powers that basically were the main engines in driving the end of World War II. One was the United States, both as the arsenal of democracy and basically pushing in on both fronts, both European and on the Pacific front, and the Soviet Union, who bore the brunt of fighting the Axis powers in the land war in Europe. And so these two powers, certainly the other European powers were still there, but they were much diminished at the end of World War II. And so you could definitely see that sort of, and like what are some of the biggest events is when the Soviet and American armies linked up at the end of World War II. You could definitely see that the stage was being set for the post-war period, despite the fact that all during the occupation, most of these countries were divided up into 4 zones, right, which were 3 Allied zones: UK, America, and French zones, and then the Soviet zone. You could kind of see that these were the two dominant powers coming out of World War II were going to be the United States and the Soviet Union. The third party in all of this was the Old World, which was basically all of the European colonial powers, but all of them had been dramatically devastated by the onset of World War II. Not only do you have the winning powers, but also the losing Axis powers. Like in that sense, the old colonial system was on its last legs. The colonial powers had actually drawn upon their colonies to fight World War II, and this would also have repercussions. But essentially, what we saw is that it went from a multipolar game to what we call a bipolar game. In other words, 2 poles, which is the United States and and the Soviet Union. Let me go here. So part and parcel to all of that was during this conflict, a lot of the European colonial powers, of course, kind of relied heavily on colonial support, particularly like the UK and the French. And because of this heavy reliance on their colonial forces, that also spurred, within these colonies, a notion of renewed independent drive for independence and nationalism once the war was over. Hey, we helped, it's our turn now. And that was also met by the fact that many of the European countries were quite devastated by the end of World War II. And as a result of that, there was a diminished ability for the European powers to even maintain their colonial grip. I mean, in the 40s and the 50s, there were actually a lot of colonial conflict. And you see that's when the emergence of sort of the colonial world becoming independent nation states. And that also was a driving factor in kind of changing the face of World War II. That also meant that the European powers, although they were sort of nominally part of this state system, that really the two dominant poles end up being the United States and the Soviet Union, both which were somewhat anti-colonial. I mean, the United States definitely had its colonial interests, but it was far diminished compared to the European powers. And so there was a general notion of pushing for decolonialization. So, okay. So, what does that mean? That basically creates a context where most of the world and most of the world's population were no longer under the power system that they were previously. The last factor in sort of like changing the way the Cold War sort of and post World War II kind of set the context for everything is the fact that there was a new arms race. And the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki definitely heralded a new era. It's a little tricky because at the time, this wasn't quite understood, the impact that the atomic weapons would have. It was just thought of as a bigger bomb. And in fact, in terms of theory, you will actually find that a lot of, in hindsight, in retrospect, we see that as kind of a watershed moment in which history changed and the nature of sort of international politics and sort of international strategy changed. But at the time, it kind of was, well, we developed a bigger bomb, and it was a more efficient bomb. It was a bomb that instead of having to send fleets of bombers to destroy a target, you could just send one or two bombers. And so the notion that this had somehow changed everything kind of took a little while to percolate. But the truth is, it was such a powerful weapon, and it had such an impact politically that that it was seen as the key to being a major power. So although the United States had a monopoly at the end of World War II, not only were there Axis nuclear development programs, both Germany and Japan were pursuing atomic weapons. But then immediately after this, the Soviet Union also basically created a crash program to develop weapons too, because it was seen as a tremendous advantage for the United States, right? So all of this kind of sets a context for armor development in the post-World War II period. Okay, so this is stuff that we've actually covered before, but I thought I'd kind of go over it again because it really does set context for this. And yeah, I just saw some comment that someone went to Nagasaki. Interestingly enough, I've actually been to Hiroshima and been at Ground Zero, and it's really amazing because the city actually all rebuilt around it. But then this one area where they just kind of left it, and in fact, it was one of the few standing buildings. I think you can see. Is this one Hiroshima, Nagasaki? Oh, I can't really tell. But there's actually only one building, and because it was kind of a steel girder building, it was one of the few buildings that had survived. A weird personal story, anecdotal story, is that my grandmother was an American. She was born in an American territory. She was born in Hawaii, and then she met my grandfather, and then they moved back to Japan, and then World War II broke out. So she was actually an American in Japan during World War II, which was kind of tough. She was a Japanese American, but she was still in Japan, and so my family was on my mother's side was right outside of Hiroshima in a town called Iwakuni, and it's weird because I heard stories about them of the day the bomb fell on Hiroshima. In fact, my grandmother saw a big flash and she said, "What the heck is that?" And then my grandfather, who was in the railroads at the time, actually went into Hiroshima on the trains to bring all the burn victims out because they didn't know what was going on. But it was interesting too because my grandmother said, the government kept saying, well, it was just an ammunition dump explosion. And he goes, America couldn't have made a bomb like that. And because my grandmother was American, she's like, no, America probably could make a bomb like that. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. Oh, and by the way, they were part of like long-term radioactive studies, and they were okay. I mean, they passed in their 90s, so it because they weren't in the immediate blast area, so it's not like that. But anyway, that's just kind of an interesting personal story on take on that. But in any case, so this fundamentally changes sort of the way we think of warfare, because the ability to destroy one city was pretty frightening. And the fact that once we started building up an arsenal of nuclear weapons, it became possible to basically destroy all the major cities of your opponent. And that kind of changes the calculus in terms of thinking about warfare. Let's see now. So modern tactics. And so all of these things, the context in terms of a bipolar world, which is the United States versus the Soviet Union, and this whole idea of devastating weapons really ends up affecting how tactics evolve in the post-war period. And also, we really do need to look at, when we think of World of Tanks, and we have this discussion internally all the time, World of Tanks, if you look at the way tank development works, tiers 3 through about 8, that's World War II, right? That's like depending on when you start the calendar, when you start it when Japan is, basically occupying, invading China, or do you start it during the European side of the war, or do you start it when American involvement is? There's a lot of different calendars to where you start it, but roughly you're talking about a 5-year to 10-year period, and you're talking about a good 5-6 tiers of tanks. That's a lot of development in a very short period of time. The post-war period ends up looking like it's much slower, but really what it is that it's a different kind of arms race going on. And so that's why the tactics that were influenced by the context that I just talked about really changes how tanks are designed. So the most important thing, and this is a little bit hard to understand, I think, unless you grew up during the Cold War period, and I did, definitely I was a Cold War kid, is the idea that nations were playing not to lose. Before the nuclear era, everyone played to win. You thought about nuclear war and you thought about nuclear weapons, and the consequences of fighting a conflict was an all-out nuclear exchange at some point, right? Let's say you're doing really well. You're not using nuclear weapons at all. At some point, the enemy is going to be so desperate, they may contemplate using nuclear weapons. And once they use nuclear weapons, you're probably going to use nuclear weapons in a response. And I can see I've already blown past a giveaway, and I apologize.
No,
Thank
you're
you
good.
very much, Tank Source.
It's very
really
interesting. I don't want to interrupt you, but yeah,
yeah.
we're having a giveaway for 7 days of premium for your chance to enter. Type in #marathon along with your gamer tag and console of choice.
Awesome. And again, thank you everyone for participating. This is our extra live stream where we're doing basically a charity for the Extra Life Miracle Children's Hospital Network. And every dollar that you can contribute helps kids who are in the hospital. If you don't have a dollar to contribute, don't worry. Just tell your friends about the stream. Make sure that other people watch it. That's all good. There's lots of ways. And of course, participate, grab codes. All of that is participation. All of that helps. So we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Yeah, sorry. And I sometimes I get, this is why my problem is that I get a little carried away. This happens in meetings too. So I already apologize to my coworkers for that. But in any case, so what ends up happening is that you end up being more concerned with not losing than winning. And you know, this is even controversial when you talk about people who study strategy. The idea of not playing to win is antithetical. There were American, you know, like particularly like LeMay, and there were other. I will speak mostly on the American side since I was mostly a student of the American side of the strategic equation. But there were American commanders that said, no, we can't think that way. We have to think about how to win a nuclear conflict or how to win any kind of conflict. But in general, political leaders and those who are thinking about grand strategy or national level strategy said, look, if a war gets to a certain point, there is a good chance nuclear weapons will happen. So what you end up having is that despite the fact that you were engaged in a very dicey nuclear weapons escalation, right? As soon as, and someone brought up MAD, which was where I was getting to next. So as soon as you reach the point of where you have mutually assured destruction, or the ability for both sides to basically destroy each other without having to strike first, once you, or secured second strike capability, I should say, or the ability to strike back at someone if they strike at you, as soon as you enter that world, you played to not lose, basically, from a political game. And so that's why the Cold War was both a scary time and a time of a lot of bluster and a lot of escalation, and actually, frankly, an arms race. Because what ends up happening now is that conventional forces, which were thought to be obsolete at the end of World War II with the development of atomic weapons, and then later on thermonuclear weapons and everything else, ended up being even more critical, because the last thing you could do is afford to lose, because the second you lose, you resort to nuclear weapons. So that's why, once again, armor came to the forefront, ironically, after the invention of the nuclear weapon, because it was seen as either the iron fist or the iron shield in fighting future conflicts. And so that's why it suddenly became a game of playing not to lose. Another thing that came up, and this is why armored warfare ends up being really critical, is the idea of the NBC. This changed. This used to be the ABC. It even changed later too. But I'm using sort of the 80s. In sticking to the modern armor theme, I'm kind of using the through the 80s and early 90s kind of nomenclature. The NBC Battlefield, or the nuclear, biological, chemical battlefield. And although chemical weapons were really not, because of the horrific use of chemical weapons in World War I, they weren't really used in World War II. And so, but there always was a threat that chemical weapons could be used again. And also the fact that you now had the potential for atomic weapons and nuclear weapons, tactical weapons, all the way through to large-scale nuclear attacks. And the emerging threat of biological and biologically engineered weapons, that tanks ended up being an interesting thing because tanks are enclosed. They're not always designed to necessarily be able to survive everything like nuclear overpressure, the presence of external toxic chemicals, or biological agents. But that became a factor. And the fact that the tank could be made to survive these things. In fact, you see the early generation, one of the first modifications between, let's say, the T-54 and the T-55, for instance, was the adding of an overpressure system and radiological shielding. So basically that it was thought that if we had to fight in this hellish landscape where atomic weapons were going off, chemical weapons are being used, and biological weapons are being used, then the tank still had its role on the battlefield. In fact, it was really important because it could be sheltered, whereas infantry out in the open, you could give them suits and stuff like that, but those suits aren't going to protect them from everything. And so tanks were seen as the iron fist that could still manage to fight in a battlefield even after nuclear weapons were used. I saw a comment in chat. Sorry, I'm missing everybody's names, but yes, I did see threads. I saw Day After. That was the stuff that I grew up on. I was born in 1970, so I definitely, I wasn't necessarily, I'm not so early in the Cold War, like in the 60s, so I wasn't really there for that whole period with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything else. But I was definitely around for sort of like the late 70s, early 80s, and the escalation, and then the growing public consciousness of what mutually assured destruction at the scale that the arms race had taken it to really represented. And that is definitely sort of, plays into this. Like, this is part of the equation of why you play not to lose. In any case, so yeah, tanks are seen as one of those weapons that could still fight in this nuclear, biological, and chemical war, battlefield. And like, first of all, you can shield them from radiation, and second of all, you can overpressure the tank. You can overpressure the tank so that it pushes atmosphere out and things like that. Yeah, both sides did. I just referred to like the T-54 and the T-55 because that's one of those classic ones where there's a version of it that's not NBC'd, and then there's my major revision number actually come from NBC revisions. There were definitely some other tech upgrades as well, but definitely that's kind of the thinking, is that there was a move in the future to produce tanks that had better and better NBC protection, and that was considered important. Overpressure systems and all these other things to keep air out and filtering it and things like that. Yeah, and if you grew up during that era, you probably remember the whole, drop in cover, where if you saw the flash of an atomic bomb, you were to drop in cover. Yeah, if you're in a major metropolitan area, that's a little unrealistic, but I will say that from earlier atomic weapons that were lower yield, that is definitely viable. Once you get to the larger nuclear weapons, that's a little optimistic, because that flash is typically enough to blind. There was a lot of studies. We destroyed a lot of islands in the Pacific. A lot of research was done on that, and I think we understood it much better afterwards. Oh, we have a giveaway winner. Who is it?
Our giveaway winner, yeah, we have one. Let's take a look. It is...
Drum roll.
Takano Streams. Congratulations, Takano.
Oh, congratulations. Cool. What'd they win?
Oh, they won 7 days of premium time.
Awesome. You can always use that. And 7 days of premium is always useful.
To keep this rolling, we give away another tank.
Ooh, okay. What are you going to give away?
Let's do I saw people excited earlier. Let's go again with another Bat Chat Brask.
Oh, Brask.
So,
Okay, cool.
so for a chance to win, do you have a hashtag on the storeway here?
Oh, let me think about it. Let's do hashtag Cold War.
Sounds great. For a chance to win your own Bat Chat Brask, enter in your gamertag console and hashtag Cold War. All right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Anyway, so again, the actual topic. Oh, by the way, all of these photos, I made sure they're either sort of National Archive, U.S. Army photos or stuff like that, because those are all in the public domain. A few of them are my personal pictures, and some of them are wargaming pictures. So in general, I realize that we're supposed, for educational purposes, it's okay to just sort of take pictures, but I thought I'd specifically do that. I think this actually is one of the Reforger exercises, which is the reinforced Germany exercises that NATO used to do. Basically, where the idea was a lot of the equipment was pre-positioned in Europe, and then although a lot of the U.S. troops were still in CONUS or continental U.S., they would be brought rapidly into the European theater should a conflict with the Soviet Union emerge. And a lot of these readiness exercises was the fact that on the NATO side, you're talking about a large number of countries that have to coordinate their nuclear and conventional forces, and also that a lot of these militaries would have to work in sort of cooperation. And on the Soviet side, they also did a lot of these large-scale exercises as well. There's a lot of interesting history about it, and there's even some interesting derivative, like entertainment too, like so keep an eye out if you're kind of a connoisseur of the Cold War stuff. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of books too. Like I was heavily influenced by Clancy's Red Storm Rising, or like Team Yankee by Coyle, and all this other stuff. There was a lot of books about the speculative World War III, which is always very interesting.
Interesting question here. Not to put you on the spot, not sure if you
Oh,
know, but
sure.
it's Elliot 2751 is asking, does the Challenger 2 have an overpressurized system?
Challenger 2 is late enough. So I see, the thing is that I was actually looking at Soviet NBC systems. I didn't really look at NATO ones. Overpressure is the common system, because what it basically means is that the pressure inside the vehicle is higher than the pressure outside. So even if you have a breach, you basically keep the pressure inside higher so that nothing gets in. A lot of other tanks use a filtration system, so they didn't necessarily change the pressure differential between the inside. I mean, you always have, I guess most of them sought some kind of pressure differential, but a lot of them also use filtration. So the other option is to make sure that you filter the air and everything else. Most of it is to be rad hardened, and a lot of that means that also that your equipment has to also be able to handle radiation, and that only works to a certain degree. I mean, they did test a lot of it. More, the idea isn't that it would survive a nuclear blast, but that it could go into an area that had been blasted by a nuclear weapon and still be viable. Chemical weapons were always tricky. You'll notice that the biggest problem is that, like, these MOP suits, were the chemical protection suits, a lot of the crew would have to wear them, and you think, well, they're in the tank, that's fine. Yeah, it's fine, but whoever's servicing the tank also has to wear these. So the idea was that chemical weapons would really change the dynamic of the battlefield, which is why they did a lot of these chemical weapons training. Because, for instance, imagine, you throw a tread, somebody's got to repair that tread, or even you're back at the bay and you got to fuel up and stuff like that. Everyone having to work with that tank, if they're in a semi-exposed position, would have to be in chemical protection gear if you were under threat of chemical attack. So it really that really fundamentally changes these things. So the tanks themselves were meant to operate for short periods of time in contaminated zones, but the whole support system also had to be able to survive that, which is kind of tough.
We had
Uh,
Blue Soda confirm here that the Challenger 2 and all subsequent tanks have overpressure systems, but the Challenger 1 had a filtration system.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So overpressure, the Soviets pursued that much earlier. A lot of the NATO tanks were filtration. Like I was surprised because, I don't actually live in tanks, right? So like I said, I'm not like a subject matter expert, but like air conditioning wasn't in a lot of tanks until much later, which always like so the British had their their BV thing way before I think they had air conditioning, which is kind of scary, um but in any case, yeah. So anyway, so the NBC Battlefield. So, but again, that's why tanks. That's why tanks are sort of an important, or armor, I should say, armor. All of the sort of the post-war armor was one way to have a strike force and have the ability to operate in contaminated zones. And so that's kind of the theory behind all of that. The next thing that kind of changes in so this is not that this is a totally new concept. Sort of the idea of combined arms. Usually they kind of think of World War II as being the first real sort of combined arms war because you had the integration of land, sea, and air assets. But really, this came to a pinnacle once you started having a lot more data processing and once you started having much more communications. I mean, even in World War II, not every tank had a radio because that was really expensive. I think the U.S. did, but most countries, that's somewhat of a luxury. So, I think maybe the Germans did too. But in any case, uh, sort of the common, we think of radios and all this other stuff as being really commonplace, but those type of advanced electronics were still somewhat rare. By the time you get into sort of the post-war period, every tank has radio. Every tank, like almost everybody has electronic equipment, and the coordination and the amount of information and the information flow really increases, which means battle management becomes a lot more tricky. And that's why you start having C3I, which is, command, control, communications, and intelligence. And this becomes, it was always important, don't get me wrong, but in the modern era, as we move into the post-war period, this becomes a larger and larger share of what influences weapons design, because not only do you want to know where everyone is, you want to know their condition, you want to know their situation, because tanks end up moving really fast, and the idea that warfare can happen. You don't have these massive fronts that move miles in a day. You could have small battle groups that move, very quickly around in a very fluid battlefield, and that's possible. Sort of as technology progresses, it's possible to have, smaller units in a rapidly changing situation, and the only way to manage all of that is through electronics. Did I hear? Do we have another? No.
Oh no, sorry, I was probably stretching. We do have more giveaways to give here.
Oh,
So
cool, cool. So let's keep going at it. Oh my God, I'm running out of time. I gotta go through. I haven't even got to the tanks yet. Oh my God, sorry.
yeah,
Hey
yeah,
guys,
we're good.
sorry about that. I'm going off on tangents. I really apologize. But in any case, so all of these factors really kind of influence post-war tank design. So now we get to modern armor, which is really cool, and that's kind of why we're all here, right? So basically, the first thing we have to understand is that we're start pushing the limit. So in World War II, basically the thickness of your armor in steel, whether it be straight or angled, is the amount of penetration that you can resist. And you start running into the fact that, in order to get more penetration resistance, you need more steel, and more steel weighs more. And so that's a typical example of how you kind of start reaching the limits of physics, because the material science says, look, if you want more armor, you need more thickness. If you need more thickness, you need more weight. If you need more weight, either your tank is heavier or goes slower, right? And so, you kind of have this maximum. You also have this idea that there's only so much volume that you can have enclosed in a steel case, right? The engines can only produce so much horsepower per pound of tank, per pound of tank engine, or whatever you want to call it, the energy efficiency ratio, and all these other things. So you started during World War II, because it was such a short period of time, and because a lot of basic research that wasn't directly related to the war effort kind of wasn't there. These were the limitations. And so that's why, I mean, you think about it, compare a tier 3 or 4 tank to like a tier 8 tank. I mean, they fought in the same war. They didn't fight at the same time, but they fought in the same war. And so the idea that there was such rapid development, but they started reaching sort of the limits of what that technology could do. And what the post-war period does is that because it's a more prolonged period of time, because we are now dealing with the potential of war, and everyone was gearing up their militaries to either fight a war that hadn't happened or to prevent a war from happening, there was time for a lot of these post-war technologies to kind of enter into it. And all of these technologies really had a fundamental way of changing how tanks work, right? So whenever we talk about tank design, and this is of course pretty straightforward and very basic, but there are three, it's basically a tank pie. And you guys, because you play this game, this is all kind of, sometimes we do some of these stuff too, just to make sure that like press and media are more informed, because they often say weird things about tanks when they talk about tank games. And that's also something that I do, is talk to the press sometimes. But basically, I'm just going to going over this because it makes sense. That basically, if you think of a tank as an armor pie, right? And so the armor pie is a ratio of protection, mobility, and firepower. And within a given technology, right, within a given sort of era, you can't you basically have to make compromises between these three slices. Like, if you want more protection, you're probably going to have to give up a little bit of mobility and a little bit of firepower. If you want more firepower, you're going to have to give up some. And, we see all of our major tank lines kind of emerging from this. The difference between heavy tanks, medium tanks, light tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery are kind of playing off on these compromises, right? The thing about the post-war period is that we see the tank pie also grow. Like, there's ability through advanced technologies to also expand and change each one of these categories, right? And so let's talk about some of the innovations that happen in all of these things. So first of all, sorry?
Oh, let's announce the winner, and then we'll get
sorry,
another one going.
yeah. Who's our winner here?
Our winner is Brass Dragon. Congratulations, Brass Dragon. He got a Batch Head Brask.
Cool.
And we're going to go ahead and start another giveaway here. And this one is for 1 million silver.
Jeez, 1 million silver. Okay, no, sorry.
You think that's too much? I mean, we could tone it down a little bit.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to do the little pinky thing. Anyway, in any case,
the hashtag is...
Oh, hashtag is
Armor Pie.
Modern Armor. No, Armor Pie. Armor Pie. Armor Pie. Yeah, let's go with Armor Pie. Okay, cool.
I mean, how can you not?
How can I not? Yeah, I want a good slice of Armor Pie. All right, so in any case, so this is a World War II technology, but it really came to light sort of after, in the late war and early Cold War periods, is basically the shape charge, right? And we think of heat rounds and all this other stuff. And, I struggled to find a good cutaway picture. It's amazing that this is actually kind of hard to find. That's in the public domain. But if you notice the front part of that shell, you will actually see that the red is simulated in this cutaway, the explosives. You'll notice that there's a copper cone in there, and that copper cone is why we call this a shape charge, because basically what happens is that when the tip of that shell hits its target, it sets off the igniter, and the igniter detonates the explosives. But that cone, actually what it does is that it reforms that copper into a copper plasma, and the plasma jet ends up being much narrower than the size of the shell. And so what this does is that it concentrates a lot of energy into a very pinpoint area, which means less surface area, which means less armor protection, and you have all the energy of that explosive shooting a plasma too. So this is what we think of when we think of heat rounds, which do exist during the sort of the late World War II period. But really, the other thing that this warhead does is that it allows you to develop a more portable weapon system, and which brings me to the next point. Oh, actually, wait, before we get there, this is one of my own personal photos, and this is, I don't know if I've shown it on one of these streams or not, but this is of a, what was it, an M48? Oh yeah, it was an Israeli M48A4, and the guy brought us up, and we walked around the whole tank, and I was like, and he said, oh, this was a battlefield kill. And he goes, I bet you can't find it. And so we were walking around, and I go, what's wrong with that hitch back there? And so I kind of look back there and I go, what the heck is that? This is basically where an RPG-7 shape charge, the plasma, basically the copper plasma hit the rear of the tank. It first hit the hitch, and then it penetrated into the rear armor and then took out the engine, making this a mobility kill. So as you can see, instead of the larger size that we typically think, what a shape charge does is it creates a very intense amount of energy at a very small point, right? And that's so this whole tank was killed by that one little hole, as opposed to a big gaping hole that we think of when a high caliber round hits a tank.
Right.
So
I feel like most people, and like myself included, like I always just imagine like a bigger entrance charge.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. So, and you know, if you think about a big kinetic energy round, you know, like 105 millimeter round of M48, you know, so maybe like 90 or something like that, you know, something that's like 9-10 centimeters across, right? This is what you get when you get a shape charge. So all that energy is concentrated into that very small plasma stream. And somebody's commenting on my audio quality. I really apologize. This is why we don't stream as much from home, because my equipment here is crappy. My heater's going on. Anyway, but in any case, so that's kind of, that gives you an idea. And it was really funny because, well, not funny, but I saw this in person, and it was just shocking to me to see that very small puncture wound as being basically a mobility kill. The other thing that a shape charge does is that it means you don't need the same amount of kinetic energy to get a kill. So that's when we start seeing the emergence of ATGMs, or anti-tank guided missiles, because now you can put one of these fused warhead explosions, and it has the same effect as hitting something with a large kinetic round at a very high speed. Missiles, of course, go much slower, but because they go slower and because they have guidance control, you can guide them. So for instance, you know, the first generation of ATGMs were largely wire guided, which means then you can actually see it. It's amazing how hard it is to find some of these pictures. I had to use a Wikimedia Commons picture here, but basically where they have wires that are all the way from the back to the firer that allow you to guide the ATGM onto its target. And then when it hits, then the fuse goes off, and that triggers the explosive, which then triggers a shape charge. Couldn't do this before you had shape charge, because that explosive wasn't enough energy compared to a kinetic energy round. But with a shape charge, you can now put it into something like a missile, and that's what made sort of the missiles more viable. And in this case, I think, you know, what you can see here is that there's several, you know, generations, and now we've moved on beyond wire guided. But that's why the early wire guided there were things you could do to defeat them, because the person who was aiming it actually had to keep the little joystick on the target and stuff. So, you know, like if they're in the open, you could fire a machine gun at them, make them flinch, whatever, and that would cause the missile to deviate. You know, in terms of real world, in a game, you kind of have to make different conceits and stuff like that to make it fun. But, you know, that's kind of the principle of ATGMs, and that kind of already starts changing the nature of warfare. The next thing that comes out of this is also, the next step is the APFSDS and the APFSDSDUs, which are armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot, or and sometimes depleted uranium. And these are basically where, instead of the using large caliber guns to fire a very high kinetic energy round, but immediately you have a sabot that breaks off. And they were playing with this in World War II, but it really didn't come into fruition until in the post-war period. And so, like in this case, you see this penetrator, which was, you try to make that of the highest density material as possible. So a lot of them are tungsten, unless they have the DU on it, in which case it's depleted uranium. And then you have this, it almost like an old thread spool, you know, like that looks on there, because you're basically trying to hold a very small pin into a larger diameter shell. And so you imbue all of that kinetic energy into this thing, and then the sabots fall away. Like if you see the slow-mo videos of it, you'll see these things fall away. I think they're usually in threes or fours. I don't know what the aerodynamics of it, but basically the sabot breaks away and then that thin penetrator goes through. So this is kind of the same effect that you would see in a shape charge, where you turn all that the explosive energy into a plasma bolt. You are now conveying all that energy into a thin, long penetrating rod. And so what happens is that instead of the diameter of the kinetic energy round being 105 millimeters, 120 millimeters, 125 millimeters, it ends up being a very small pinpoint, which therefore means that it can defeat and penetrate armor more easily. Anyway, let's see. The next thing that happened, and this was a hard one to find pictures of because composite armor is still one of those things that's a little bit kind of secret sauce, but composite armor, and so there are some pictures out there, but they're personal pictures that people have taken at some armor museums and stuff like that, especially the Soviet stuff. But basically composite armor you started seeing these in like the T-64, and basically now there was American designs that also started playing around with this idea, but the T-64 was the first production tank where they actually started basically sandwiching in basically plates of silica into their armor. And what this ends up doing is that you'd think that, wait a minute now, we just said that to get more armor protection you needed more steel. Well, what you end up doing is that with material sciences they started sandwiching other materials between steel, and that differential in the density, and I'm no physics guy, right? So, but anyway, in the differential between the densities of these materials ends up meaning that as a kinetic energy penetrator, in this case a shape charge, hits that, the differential in densities and everything else causes it to go askew. And basically, so what you have is that you can get the same armor the same equivalent armor of, let's say, 1,000 millimeters of armor in a much smaller package, in a much lighter package. And that's what composite armor kind of brings to the table. And so basically what ends up happening is that there's this development of different ways of adding composite armor to the tanks to defeat, primarily at first, the heat rounds and shape charge warheads of ATGMs. And that becomes one of the main ways in which these things are defeated. And as it turns out, things like glass and silica and everything else actually have amazing armor properties, but they're not very dense. So to get the same armor equivalent, you need a lot of it. But if you sandwich it with steel, you get properties of both. And there's also the effect of them being kind of stacked against it. So that's the sort of composite armor. And that ends up also, so this is growing the pie again. So instead of it just being more and more steel, now you have different ways that you can manage the steel. The next thing that comes up, and again, this is kind of a Soviet innovation to start, and then pretty much everyone adapts it, is the idea of using explosive reactive armor. And this is an idea where you actually have explosive plates that are kind of ready to, so that when something hits it, the explosive between the plates goes off and it pushes that plate out, and it pushes that plate out against whatever incoming plasma beam is coming in. And when that happens, it causes the plasma to kind of disperse rapidly. It's like having a giant spaced armor that isn't spaced until it's hit. I think that's the best analogy that you can think of. And oh, sorry, do we have more? Oh gosh, we're running out of time. Okay, so then we have reactive armor, and then on the mobility side, so I'm going to start parting through this. Everyone started looking at turbines, which are basically putting jet engines into tanks. Not everyone did it. That caused a lot of problems in terms of technology and everything else. That's why you have things like the mass-produced T-72 and stuff like that, where they basically have to change. Integrating a jet engine into a tank is really, really hard. But that they definitely saw a huge increase in horsepower. The other thing that they did is they added auxiliary power units. And basically what this did is that a generation of power, not through the main engine, which then allows the engine to be run more efficiently and all this other stuff. Okay. Oh, no. Okay, so let me just run through real quickly now that this is an era beyond our game, but kind of where the future goes. So one thing that we see is at the end of the Cold War then also changes the political landscape. So now all of a sudden you're not thinking about conventional warfare against, other major powers, but you have to start thinking about, like nation building and urban environments and, sort of civil warfare and all this other stuff. And then you also start thinking about situational awareness and increasing the sensor arrays on tanks and increasing their ability. And then also the idea of active defense, like, APSs, which basically intercept incoming rounds, and they can work against kinetic energy rounds and against shape charge rounds. And automation. I'm sorry I blew through this. We will hopefully have a chance to talk about more of this stuff later. And because I think we're going to be transferring over to one of our community next. I'm really sorry I powered through that.
That's correct. Yeah, we have Chief Trade coming up next.
Oh, so, see, I don't want to steal from his segment, so I apologize for that. Sorry, we kind of had to rush through that at the end. We can talk about this at some other time, but anyway, thank you very much. And in about 19 hours or so, I'll do another segment.
It's funny saying like in 19 hours, right? But to wrap this segment up, we're just gonna go ahead and draw our winner here.
Oh, cool,
for,
cool.
The 1 million silver, and our winner is June. Congratulations.
Oh, congratulations. Cool.
You are the winner. So
awesome.
You enjoy that, and
cool.
Stay tuned. We have lots more to go. It's only been like 3 hours, right?
So 3 hours, yeah.
We have a long time to go. So yeah, lots more goodies coming your way.
Yeah. And, sorry to go over.
Yeah.
All right. I'll see you guys.
We'll talk to you guys later. Take care.
Bye-bye.